20 years in the making, and finally ready for you. Tonight, the Apostle P reviews the Sebenza from Chris Reeve Knives. This particular version, the Large Sebenza 21, left-handed. Stay tuned. Hi gang, Rob here. It is the evening of 17 September 2013. And that's right, tonight, years in the making, I finally get to review the Chris Reeve Sebenza, and we'll be looking at my personal Sebenza 21 large variety, left-handed. We're going to start off by giving a little bit of history, as you've come to expect on the Apostle P channel. And this is history that I have followed and studied over many years. Let's get right into it. Who's the man? Chris Reeve. Chris Reeve was born in Durban, South Africa. Sort of a tool and die maker for a while in his life. Also served a compulsory stint in the South African military during his time as a soldier, like many knife makers. He identified the need for a tool in his duties that really wasn't available to soldiers in his time and place: a good knife. So sort of self-taught, Chris began to use his metalworking and engineering mind to start to fashion his own knives, and he made fixed blades during that time in his life. Started off using whatever steel was available and wooden handles, and he found out quickly that the environments that he worked in were not conducive to the steels or handle materials that he first had at his disposal. The carbon steels and tool steels would corrode if they were on the coast. If they were inland in arid climates, the wood that he used for his handle material would dry and crack and fall apart. So in his mind, he started to conceive of a revolutionary kind of fixed blade that ended up putting him on the map, so to speak. It was a one-piece blade and handle fashioned of stainless steel. After his military service ended, he spent a little time competitively racing motorcycles. Was not extremely successful, didn't have a big budget. And sooner or later, he put away childish things, so to speak, and went into the knife making business. First making those one-piece stainless fixed blades in his garage in the mid-'80s, starting about in 1984. And then when he started to get busier and volume went up and he started to get some international distributors interested in his knives, well, he had to buy another house with a bigger garage. Pretty soon he hired one assistant. And then by 1987, his wife Ann went to work for him. And that is when the idea of this knife first came into Chris Reeve's head, 1987. For about 4 years, the Sebenza was in development, and during those intervening years, he developed relationships with some American distributors and even a couple knife companies. In 1987, he partnered with Mike Stewart, then of Blackjack Knives, to distribute and market Chris Reeve knives in the United States. And that project, or that venture, was very successful. However, Blackjack Knives went bankrupt within about a year of their association. But Chris Reeve Knives did not go down with that ship. But by 1988, he started to contemplate emigrating to the United States. Conditions in South Africa at that time, guys, if you know your history, were not conducive to a white South African trying to run a business and have a steady and stable labor force. So the Reeves moved to Idaho, settling near Boise. They rented some commercial space to start a small factory making knives, which they did, and by 1991, the original Sebenza went into production. Chris began to attend trade shows and increased the profile of Chris Reeve Knives dramatically. It was kind of interesting for him as he sort of hatched his knife-making plot out of his own mind by himself on his own wits and with his own determination. It was interesting for him to be amongst recognized and talented knife makers, and as he looked around, he realized he had something. What was it, in 1996, after 5 years of production of the original Sebenza, the new Sebenza came out. A little change in styling, a little sleeker, a little more refined. But by the year 2000, some of those old Sebenza customers began to request their old Sebenza back, and that was the year that the Sebenza Classic was released, 2000. And it remained pretty much the same until 2008, 21 years after the conception, so to speak, of the Sebenza, that the 21 was released. And that's the knife that you're gazing at now. The 21 remains in production today. It's been joined in the lineup by the Sebenza 25, released in 2012, 25 years after the original design was hatched. With some changes that some of us like and some of us don't, and some of us like some of the changes, and some of us would just rather we stick to the 21. That's a point we're not going to get into in this review. We're talking about the 21. Probably the most prolific of all Sebenzas. Let's talk about the company for a minute and its standing and place in the production knife world. And yes, these are production knives. Chris Reeve Knives employs 35 people in Idaho. Yes, in Idaho, as the handle says. Using pretty much state-of-the-art equipment by the knife-making world standards. And you know, this is a knife that a lot of people in forums and on YouTube like to talk about. Some of us like to rave about Chris Reeve Knives, and some of us like to take pot shots at Chris Reeve Knives. But let's look at some rather objective data, shall we? Blade Magazine holds its Blade show every year, has for many years, several decades, I believe. Every year, they give an award called the Manufacturing Quality Award. Let's just count them, shall we? The first time Chris Reeve Knives won the Manufacturing Quality Award of Blade Magazine was the year 2000. They did it again in 2001. They did not receive that award in 2002. I don't know, maybe they were sick that day. And then beginning in 2003, an astounding, staggering dynasty began, and they won their next Manufacturing Quality Award, and they have not relinquished it since. I believe that makes 13 of them. And guys, the knife making world is a bit eccentric, shall we say. There are lots of egos, lots of hurt feelings, lots of jealousy, lots of skill. And for 13 out of the last 14 years and 11 in a row, all those minds and egos and jealous hearts have gotten together and said, yeah, Chris Reeve Knives has the best manufacturing quality of any production knife company. Say what you will, that fact speaks for itself. Now, I will tell you, although I think my analysis of this knife is going to be pretty objective, I will cop to being a huge fan of Chris Reeve Knives. His philosophy is very, very simple. He and his company design and execute edged tools and weapons the right way, as defined by Chris Reeve. It costs what it costs to produce the knives that he conceives in his mind. He knows that he designs them well and builds them well as they can be, and has faith that people will pay what it costs to own them because of how they're made, how they last, how they work. And it's been a pretty successful philosophy for Chris Reeve Knives. Let's talk about the blade, shall we? First, let's get some dimensions and materials out of the way. I'm going to kind of try to do this review for people who have never seen a Chris Reeve Sebenza. Most of you probably have, but some of you might not have. Some of you might be younger folks who have been collecting knives for a few years, and as with most of us, your tastes start to get more expensive in your eye and hand starts to get more discerning, and the Sebenza is something you've heard about, maybe in a YouTube video or maybe on some posts on a forum, and your curiosity is piqued and you got on YouTube to look for Chris Reeve Sebenza reviews and you stumbled on this one. I'm going to try to do the knife justice and give you the information you need to know what this is. First of all, dimensions. We've got a blade length of 3 5/8 inches, 3.625 inches. A handle length of 4.71 inches, giving us an overall length of 8.335 inches. Blade stock thickness, 1/8 of an inch, 0.125 inches. The thickness of the handle scales is 0.15 inches. The overall weight of the knife, 4.7 ounces. Blade steel in this day and age is Crucible CPM S35VN powdered metal technology stainless steel. Prior steels used in the Sebenza were S30V, and both of those steels were developed by Crucible in conjunction with Chris Reeve. What they were trying to achieve both times were steels with extremely fine grain structure, great homogeneity, knives that would be very corrosion resistant, would be very tough, would retain an edge very well, that would take a very keen edge and be resistant to chipping and cracking. S30V, Chris Reeve thought, was a pretty good attempt S35VN is kind of the steel he wanted in the beginning. And they sort of arrived at that on the second attempt. Before the crucible steels, the Sebenza was produced in BG42. The handle material is titanium. The alloy is 6Al4V, pretty much the industry standard for titanium handles. The clip material is the same. The bright hardware, the stainless steel hardware, is 303 stainless. And it is proprietary. It is Chris Reeve hardware. I want to spend a little time now talking about the nature and character of this particular folding knife. Now, if we think about the background Chris Reeve had when he started thinking about making knives, he was a soldier who wanted a soldier's tool. The Sebenza, the first folding knife to come out of that mind, was marketed in soldier magazines. It was marketed to operators, shall we say, because of his background and his philosophy about knives. So does that make it a tactical blade? Well, if tactical blade means the tool of a soldier, I guess it is. Is it primarily designed to be a weapon? I would say no. Let's look at its name, Sebenza. According to Chris, the Zulu word for work. This knife is made to work. It's made to work hard. It's made to work hard for a long time with easy maintenance. And should one of these finely crafted and very heavy duty parts break, designed to be easily serviced. So if we evaluate the Chris Reeve Sebenza based on its prowess as a weapon, I think we miss the point. Having said that, can it be a tactical blade in the sense of a defensive or offensive weapon? I don't know, you tell me. I've got a 3 5/8 inch blade, beautiful and rather deadly looking drop point, great penetrator, lots of belly for slashing. How's my purchase? Well, I've got a beautifully ergonomic, slightly sway-backed handle, very straight, with an excellent finger groove that just, your index finger just lays in it beautifully. In the saber grip, I've got jimping that is rounded from side to side, just deep enough and just sharp enough to catch your thumb and not let it go. I've got all 4 fingers on this grip. What if I spin it around into a reverse grip? My thumb just naturally lies over the pommel of that knife. My pinky captured nicely by that finger choil. Yeah, it's a weapon. And a rather strong weapon, I might add. But that's not really why it was made. But you know what? A secondary or third option when your life's in danger, it'll get the job done, guys. Now, stuff that you can't see when you watch a video on a Sebenza. And guys, I'm like you. The reason that I have admired this knife for 20 years and not reviewed it until now is because I'm a normal guy. I am a middle-class husband and father on a budget. I have a lot of knives in my collection. I have never owned a Sebenza. I budgeted for it. I saved for it. When there was enough money to buy one, I bought one. And let's face it, guys, most of us who are watching a YouTube video, maybe the tens or hundreds of thousands of knife guys who watch them, have probably never held one in our hands. So what is it that you feel when you pick up a Sebenza? You know, frankly, when you see it on camera, it looks like this elegant, rather svelte, not particularly overbuilt, graceful tool. Doesn't weigh a lot, it's 4.7 ounces. Doesn't have a super long blade, just 3 5/8 of an inch. But when you get it in hand, you know, the word I've heard best describe this knife I heard said today by John at One All's Pub, who got his new Insingo 21 the same day I got mine. Actually, 2 days after. I got mine Saturday. He got his on Monday. His word was substantial, and it certainly is that. When you first see it in person, it looks bigger than it did on camera. It feels heavier and more solid than you imagined it would. And then when you start to use it and manipulate the controls on the knife, you realize this thing is built better than I thought it could be. As many raves as we've heard about Sebenzas over the years, I submit to you that you can't truly appreciate how well this knife is built until you spend some time with it. Let's just take a look. Now, I have had this knife for a few days, and it hasn't spent much time out of my pocket or hand. It's already even got a little wear on it. Take a look at the spine of the handle. This is from closing it with my wedding ring on. You might even see that the thumb lug is starting to develop a little shine on the button. Yeah, my hand has spent some time getting used to this thing. The smoothness, the solidity, the sureness of this knife just can't be described. You just have to feel it. I want to talk a little bit now about the manufacturing process and why a base model large Sebenza, which this is, costs $410. Yeah, $410 for a production knife. I think when I get done explaining this, you might be able to understand why this $410 production knife is a bargain and a great value. I'm going to quickly fly through the high points of the production process for this knife. You can see it in more detail if you go to Blade HQ's YouTube channel, Knives HQ. In their playlist, Meet the Makers, I believe, you will find a 2-part series, a plant tour of Chris Reeve knives. That'll do this much more justice than I will, but I'm going to give you the high points as I see them. Things no other production knife that's half or 2/3 or 3/4 the cost, even twice the cost, have in their process that make this the knife it is. First of all, look at these titanium handle slabs. Titanium is a material that when you order it to a certain thickness, it comes very inconsistent and not very flat. After they are water jet cut, the next operation is for them to be surface ground on both sides to a flatness tolerance of 3/10,000ths of an inch. Then they're precisely machined in several stages on CNC equipment. So you have 2 perfectly flat, perfectly parallel pieces of titanium. That's where we start. And then let's look at the suspension of the knife, the construction, the things that hold it together. We've got 3 points of contact or assembly for this knife. One is this back fastener where the blue titanium bushing is, and then you've got the stop pin, and then you've got the pivot itself. See, the symmetry, the consistency, the parallel structure of this knife is so awesome. Each of these 3 points, pivot, stop pin, and back pillar, are all identical pivot assemblies with different bushings. This titanium, or this blue anodized stainless steel bushing is just a bushing around a pivot. The stop pin is a bushing around a pivot, a little smaller in diameter. And then the pivot has a bushing that is ground to plus or minus 1.5 10,000ths of an inch in diameter and precisely fits into the hole in the tang of the knife that is also ground to an inside diameter plus or minus 1.5 10,000ths of an inch. Now I'm spending so much time talking about these 3 points because these bushings, all 3 a little different, are also ground after they're cut to length to a height, once again, plus or minus 1.5 10,000ths of an inch. That's a little different construction, isn't it, than we're used to seeing on a folding knife. Even the best ones, they have those hourglass-shaped shouldered standoffs. Well, I would submit to you, and you guys with engineering minds will know what I'm talking about, this method is much more precise. When you have a shouldered pillar, you've got a cutting tool that goes in and cuts that shoulder, and then it's going to have a little inside radius as it goes to that smaller diameter that goes through the handle. We really don't know how big that radius gets as production standoffs are made. Does it interfere with the handle slabs it's going into? Does it really maintain an exactly precise effective height plus or minus 1.5 10,000ths of an inch? The answer is no. That's why we have adjustable pivot screws on those knives, to make up for huge and varying tolerances in the distance between the handle slabs. And then we tie it all together with a pivot screw that, we've got 2 handle slabs that want to be apart from each other, and we draw it together until it feels right with a pivot screw. No positive stop. The Sebenza clamps both halves of the knife down with this front pivot on that pivot bushing. Dead, tight, positive. The height of that pivot bushing and these other 2 bushings on the stop pin and the back pillar are exactly the same. And the thickness of the blade and the thickness of the 2 phosphor bronze washers are exactly that same height, with just enough room to spare to make this knife able to do this with absolutely no side-to-side blade play. Do you have to adjust the pivot screw? No. When it's home, and it's perfect. Now, all that being said, each one of these knives with all those dimensionally perfect parts are put together by one guy sitting by himself at a bench, hand fitting, hand manipulating, hand testing every single knife. If he disengages the lock and the blade is a little tight, he'll take the washers out. He's got a piece of sandpaper stuck to a piece of glass, very fine, probably 2,000 grit sandpaper. He'll take those washers in a figure 8 and turn them and do them in a figure 8. Put the knife back together until he gets it to the desired silky smooth feel with no play. If he develops play after doing that with the washers, he'll take the pivot bushing out and remove material from it ever so slightly, less than a 10,000ths of an inch. Put it back together, and when it's right, it's right. Now, having said that, here's kind of another cool thing about the knife. For guys who maybe think like I do and some of you do, what's right to you might be different from that guy who was sitting at that bench assembling your knife. He might have liked something that felt hydraulic, smooth, but not terribly free. I might like a knife that's really free and a knife that I can flick out, even though Chris Reeve Knives says these knives aren't to be flicked out. That's not what they're for. Will they take it? Oh yeah, they'll take it. Is that why he makes them? No. But I don't think we've got a particular speed problem, do you? There's no wrist. Thumb breaks a detent, knife flies open. That's how I want mine. So what did I do when I took it apart after sharpening? Well, I took out my phosphor bronze washers and I did what that guy at the bench does until it was how I wanted it. Let's talk about these washers a minute. This is really, really important. I want you to be able to see. I hope you can. I hope my light's right. Can you see in between the lock bar and the frame? You should be able to see both washers. One thing that's very different about the Sebenza and other folding knives, the washer on the near side, where the lock is big enough that it gives as much support as it can and just barely clears the end of the lock bar. That washer comes all the way out to there. On the other side, opposite the lock, and I'm going to try to get you to see this, the offside washer is basically the same diameter as that round part of the tang. It goes all the way to the edge of the blade tang. So it's much bigger than the near side washer. Why would they do that? Well, they do it for support. On the inside of this lock bar, right about here, is the detent ball. Pushing in as that blade rotates around. Now, on most folding knives, with a lot of tension on the lock bar, and guys, I have not felt a frame lock that has as much tension as a Sebenza. What that does on most knives is it tips the blade tang over the edge of the washer, which is the same size as the one on the near side, and it cocks the blade. It can't do this on this knife because where the detent ball pushes, opposite that blade tang is that washer for bearing support. That's why when you close a Sebenza, the end of that blade is always perfectly in the middle, because it can't not be. If it was right when it left that guy's hand at final assembly, it's right 10 years from now. And it'll never change. You know, I'm gonna try to move this blade. You guys just watch. Are you seeing much there? I'm pushing pretty hard from side to side on that blade. It can't move. But it's still that free. That's sort of what makes a Sebenza a Sebenza. No other knife manufacturer of production knives has a process and a design that can produce a knife like this time after time after time, and that will stay like this after years of use. I want to talk a little bit about this lock bar. We've all seen, new pretenders, challengers to the throne over the last 10 years. They just don't ever seem to get this aspect right. I said in my Lion Steel SR1A video that titanium bothers me as a spring material because it doesn't have much range of motion. Much effective range of motion. What I mean by that is, if that lock bar is out here when the knife is closed, it really doesn't want to move very far in before it runs out of gas as a spring. If you take a Sebenza apart, or if you take the blade and washer assembly out of a Sebenza, this lock bar will go all the way to the other liner hard. It'll push hard all the way over. It can do that. It has that big range of motion because of how long it is. The cutout is way back here. From the end of the lock bar to the center of the cutout, it's got to be close to 3 inches, at least 2.5 inches long. What are some other knives with really strong tension on their lock bar. Spyderco Tough, the effective length of that lock bar is half as long. Yeah, it pushes really hard because it's thick, but it can't move. You know, what happens when it runs out of, when it wears and the lock bar runs out of travel? Well, you got blade play. Super strong lock bar, but you have blade play. You don't really get that in a Sebenza because there's so much range of effective spring motion in the lock bar. And they can put a lot of tension on it because of that bearing washer system I was talking about. When that knife is in this position and that lock bar is being forced out by the blade tang, it is under a lot of pressure. I mean, you hurt your thumb moving it. But look how smoothly that blade moves. Because of that washer that's so large and bears the force of that lock bar so well. It's just an amazing work of engineering, and you can't make it for $100. You can't make it for $200. You can't make it for $300. You know, do you need a knife this well made? Well, I guess not. If it's something that looks pretty and you know that you want to, you know, you're going to have it for a year or two and flip it on your couch while you're watching TV and be amazed at how smooth and fast it is. You're probably not going to ever cut much with it, and it'll be a passing fancy, and you'll get another new knife in a few months, and that one will either be sold or it'll sit on a shelf, and it really doesn't matter how good it is. This is a knife you can work with every day. You can beat it up, you can scratch up the handle, you can scar it, you can put gouges in the blade, prying stuff, and 30 years later pass down to your son, and he can do the same thing. If you get a little wear in your lockup, send it into Chris Reeve Knives, and they'll put a little larger bushing on your stop pin, dress up your lock interface, and maybe recarbonize the end of the lock bar and send it back to you, and it's like a brand new Sebenza. Even sandblast the scales for you. Let's look at this lockup. And mine, I think, is a fairly early locking Sebenza. It seems like most time as I open it, it's about 40%. It might be a little more than that right now. Kind of depends on how you open it. And there's a little variability just because of how much tension's on that lock bar and the friction on that lock face of the blade tang. Many of these come from the factory at 60%, 65%, but they really don't move much during their lifetime because the geometry is so good and the way the lock faces of the lock bar and the blade tang are prepared are so perfect. And guys, if you've had other titanium frame locks, you know how hard that is to get right. And there aren't too many companies producing titanium frame locks that get it right very consistently. Some really, really big names in the knife industry that make titanium frame locks blow it on a regular basis. And Chris Reeve's been getting it right for 25 years. Let's talk about this blade shape. I think we've belabored the mechanics of this knife enough. They are the best in the world for a production knife. I have no reservation, no hesitation in saying that. So if you appreciate that, this is your knife. Let's talk about the blade. We have a beautifully finely ground hollow ground drop point. The radius of that hollow grind is 5 inches, so it's a 10-inch diameter wheel. The thinnest point on the knife about 100 thousandths behind the cutting edge. So the knife will actually get thinner for the first almost 1/8 of an inch of sharpening before it starts to thicken, which makes it a tremendous slicer. Now, if you'll notice, if you've seen many videos or pictures of Sebenzas, the edge on my particular offering is a little shinier, and the bevel is a little broader than you'll see on a factory edge. I prefer my edges to be a little thinner than Chris Reeve likes them at the factory, especially at the tip. When these knives are sharpened at the factory, they're sharpened on a contact wheel with a belt sander, big contact wheel, so they're actually a little concave as they come off. And the knife is held at a pretty shallow angle doing the straight part of the blade, and then as they start to approach the tip, it gets steeper. What you end up with then is a bevel of a very consistent breadth from hilt to tip, but the angle changes. I prefer to keep my angle the same and let the breadth of my bevels fall where it may. So mine gets a little broad at the tip. Fine with me. You may like it, you might not. My knife is a lot sharper too than it came from the factory. Remember, Sebenza means work, and Chris Reeve Knives puts on a final edge that is convex due to the polishing process and a little obtuse. It'll hold up really, really well, but it's not going to be the most vicious slicer out of the box that you'll ever see. It does seem on the Insingo, the sheep's foot or modified Warncliffe version, the edge is a little keener, maybe a little more acute. Water break. My voice is gone. Okay. Let's look at some little details. Look at the spine. Can you guys see where the jimping ends and the crowned spine begins? Look at the three little facets. Look at how well they converge. Look how beautifully the jimping's cut. Look at the little chamfer and the little curve right at the back of the blade tang. That's done by hand, by the way. Look at the gorgeous little blue anodized thumb lug. Does it have volcano issues? Well, I guess. I'm not sure what that means after all these years. It's not particularly hard to get, and it's not sharp, and you don't want it to be sharp because this detent is a bear. It needs to be, if you're going to do that. And before I leave the blade, there is one feature I want to talk about specifically, and it's really an exciting one to me as a sharpener. Look at the ricasso or the sharpening choil area of this knife. I'm talking about this area right here. I think the light is right so you can see, and if you've been watching my videos, you know that this is a huge pet peeve of mine. You can see that the plunge grind stops right here. The cutting edge starts here. Nothing but flat from here to here. What does that allow for? Nice, even, smooth cutting edge all the way to the edge of the ricasso without any flare, without any unsharpened area. It's perfection. And it also affords a bit of a choke up. That cutting edge is not touching my index finger. I get all kinds of fine work capability there. Also, I did not mention this silky, silky stone wash. The micro finish off grind is very, very fine. And then look, I'm almost getting a reflection off that stone wash blade. Isn't it beautiful? And really, really a great little fine scratch hiding finish too. Pretty cool. Okay, let's talk about my complaints, my things I think Chris Reeve could do better. How presumptuous is that? But I got a couple. First of all, and as you guys know, titanium is not my favorite handle material, and that's, it's sort of objective, and it's sort of just a personal preference issue. This titanium is a bead blasted finish, which gives it some nice natural texture. I get that. For doing work, see, it sort of grabs your skin. Even wet, I think it's probably going to have some grippy texture to it. However, and I mentioned this earlier, this is just a few days of closing the knife with my wedding ring on my ring finger. See how I got shiny, smooth, scratchy spots on the on the spine of the handle? That's going to continue as you use these knives. They're going to get shiny spots. The corners are going to look, shiny and silver, and they're going to wear, and they're going to show scratches. There's a couple of ways you can deal with that. You can just deal with it and let it age and gain character. You can have the handle scale stone washed, which basically establishes a bit of a rub and scratch pattern, and your scratches are just going to add to it and sort of be camouflaged. I've seen a treatment done with Scotch-Brite where you just hand rub a satin Scotch-Brite finish, and you're just sort of scratching into the bead blasted finish and taking out any little fine scratches that have appeared, and sort of putting in your own scratch pattern that way. If you like, you can leave it bead blasted and send it to Idaho once a year to get spiffed a little bit. Would I be happier if it were a stone washed finish from the factory? Maybe, but then would it have the grip that the factory handle has? Probably not. Just one of those things. Here's one though. They torque these fasteners to a specified inch-pound torque at the factory. A little handheld driver with it's a little torque driver. I don't mean torques. I mean torque. It measures, it breaks at a given set torque. And then your instructions will tell you not to use Loctite on Chris Reeve Sebenza fasteners. My experience is that the torque at which they set these fasteners is not adequate without thread locker. Stop pin screws will tend to loosen. I think if they really want to not have thread locker used on their knives, and they don't want people, cranking the heads into the titanium and deforming it to keep them from coming loose, a finer thread might be in order. If you're listening, Chris, I charge nothing for that piece of advice. A finer thread will tend not to back out as much under light impacts, and just has more surface area of each, of total contact over the length of that screw. That, guys, is it. I got nothing. What I have is a nearly perfect handle, a great size to weight ratio, an awesome blade, great blade steel for the application, impeccable fit and finish, extremely tight manufacturing tolerances. I have the best folding knife in the world in my hand. Production variety. And frankly, there are many custom knives out there that cost a lot more, that are more exotic, that aren't made nearly this well. I love it. If you are a knife person, save your money, forego the $100 knife of the day a few times. Wait till you have $410. Call Justin at Blade HQ or the retailer of your choice and get you one. I would suggest on a knife like this, stay away from eBay. There are a couple authorized Chris Reeve dealer sellers on eBay, but I suggest you call a competent retailer. Talk to them on the phone. Don't just click the buy button. Have them inspect personally the knife they're going to send you. Know what to ask them. Make sure you get a good one. They're all good, but make sure you get what you want. I got nothing else to say about my Grail knife, except that I'm very, very happy it is with me. Grace to you, my friends, and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. And remember, the Word and my Sebenza 21 are sharp. Have a good night, guys.